Okay, so question 8618 says refer to figures 46, 53, and 55. What is the takeoff safety speed for operating conditions R1? So remember that our takeoff safety speed, we have to remember what our V speeds mean. So you have V1, VR, and V2, and you'll need to know all of these for this chart. V1 is our decision speed. VR is our rotation speed. I'm just going to put rotation here. And V2, this is our safety speed. And that safety speed is calculated for 35 feet AGL. So we need to find V2. That's what we're looking for. Now that we know that, we can take a look at figure 46. Right now, this doesn't mean much to us. We have to figure out how we use this chart. Then we're going to look over here at the operating conditions. I would go ahead and highlight anything that I'm using for these. I also recommend for these kinds of questions, when you have a lot of figures that you need to look at, take a scratch piece of paper and write down the operating conditions for R1 or R2 or whichever one you're using. So I have my operating conditions there, and now I'm going to look at my final chart, which is figure 55. This seems like a pretty overwhelming chart, but for these questions, you can go ahead and disregard this flap retraction setting, and we're just going to be focusing on the chart above. We're also not really worried about our takeoff EPR right now, so that takes out a lot of things. We're just looking at this chart here, and let's figure out what we need. So this chart doesn't really have an example, but it does have arrows, so you can see, like, here's an arrow. We're just going to follow that same kind of outline. So we need some kind of pressure altitude, tells us right there. We need a flap setting, we need a weight, and then we're going to make sure that we look at any adjustments we might have. So we need an outside air temperature. We have all of that in the operating conditions, but we don't have pressure altitude. So let me go ahead and clear this page. And let's go back over here. So we need to figure out a pressure altitude. If you look at this, it just says field elevation. But it doesn't actually give us a pressure altitude specifically. So where can we get that pressure altitude? We're going to get it over here on figure 46. Now, again, if you want, you can just kind of underline that it's giving you the pressure altitude. The way this chart works is you have your altimeter setting either in inches of mercury on the left here, or you have it in millibars on the right. That altimeter setting is going to be given to you in the operating conditions. You can see right here, our altimeter setting is 2950 inches. And right next to it on R2, you can see sometimes you'll be given millibars. So we know that our field elevation is 100 feet, and we know our altimeter setting is 2950. So all we're looking for over here is to figure out what the correction we need to make is to our field elevation. So on the left-hand side, it's going to give you ranges. Our altimeter setting, again, is 2950. So we're going to go to the box here that has 2950 in it. So 2944 to 2955. This is going to be my box, and I'm just going to highlight all of that. And now my correction to the field elevation to get pressure altitude is going to be this 400 feet here. And sometimes you will have to subtract. So if there's no symbol, this is adding 400 feet. You can see down here that they have subtracting. So we know that we need to add 400 feet to 100 feet. So our pressure altitude today is actually going to be 500 feet. So pressure altitude, 500 feet. So now that we have that information, we can go ahead and head on over to figure 55. Now I'm going to make a note that my pressure altitude is 500 feet. And then I'm just looking at the operating conditions from R1. So I'm following this chart left to right, and I'm going to start with my pressure altitude. So my pressure altitude is 500 feet, and these are in thousands of feet. So this box is 9,000 to 10,000, 7,000 to 9,000, 5 to 7,000, 3 to 5,000, 1 to 3,000, and then negative 1,000 to 1,000. We're only 500 feet, so we're gonna fall in this bottom box, and that means that we are looking at this row down here, somewhere in there. Now we need to figure out our outside air temperature. We go back to the operating conditions, and our outside air temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So there we go. And when we look here, we're basically just figuring out which box we are using. Are we going down here, or down here? And so when you look at that, we are given our temperature in Fahrenheit. We're not given it in Celsius, so go ahead and disregard this bottom row here. I'm not looking at these temperatures. My temperature is positive 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So negative 65 to 91, I'm gonna fall in this very first box. So I'm gonna go ahead and fall in this area here, like that. So now I know that I'm looking somewhere in this column. I'll just highlight that. And I'm gonna go left to right. So I'm gonna start over here on the left with my flap setting. Going back to the operating conditions, I'm looking for my flap position. It says 15 degrees. So I know that it's 15 degrees, which means now I know that I'm looking in this row. And we're just kind of narrowing it down as we go. The next thing is it's giving us our weight. Again, this is in thousands of pounds, so 100,000, 90,000, etc. Our weight is 90,000 pounds. Again, we're getting that from that operating condition. So we go ahead and we find 90,000 pounds, and now we're just highlighting this area. If you look at the top, it tells you V1, VR, and V2. So our V1 speed is 120. V1 is 120, and that's right here. And then our VR is 121. And our V2 is 128. Now, before you move on, make sure that you double check these V1 adjustments. We are not looking for V1, so this does not matter to us. If you were looking for V1, you would have to look for the wind and the slope, which would be given to you in the operating conditions, but we don't need to make any adjustments here because we are looking for our safety speed, which remember is V2. So now that we know our V2 is 128, we simply come back over here and we can see answer choice A is 128. We didn't need to make any corrections there. So remember, the steps that you need to go in order are you need to find your pressure altitude on figure 46. Once you find that, you're just taking whatever operating conditions and applying it left to right on figure 55.